What do you think about when you hear racism? I bet you think about apartheid, the Holocaust, slavery, Jim Crow laws. When I think of racism, I think of the Arab slave trade. I think of the Moorish slave trade of whites. I think of the Boer genocide in South Africa. I think of the genocide of 5,000 Arabs, 1964. I think of all the rape victims, the murder victims, by the hands of non-whites in the streets from 1940 to 1994, which surpasses the amount of dead in the Iraq War, the Korean War, and surpasses the amount of deaths in the Vietnam War. I think of the job and education discrimination, and I think of black-only associations, Asian-only associations, and I think of allegations of white privilege, and I think of people talking about cities or occupations being too white. When I think of racism, I think of people who claim that we are a human race, that we are all indeed one people, who then the second after that go on to say that whites somehow are uniquely evil because of historical atrocities, where on the one hand they don't exist, but on the other hand they do exist whenever it is detrimental to be white, and that somehow whites are the only one that has committed atrocities, and who willfully ignore all the good things that whites have done, and who claim that whenever blacks or other minorities, soon to be majorities, do poor, it is in part due to whites, but when minorities, soon to become majorities, do good, it is not in part of whites. That is what I think of when I think of racism. What do you think of when you hear discrimination? Well, what I think of when I hear discrimination is men having less legal rights than women, being more easily charged than women. I think of whites not being protected by hate crime laws. I think of Arabs and Hispanics being reported as white offenders whenever they commit a crime, but then all of a sudden when they are victims become an offender group, i.e. whites can only be an offender group and never an offended group, whilst Hispanics and Arabs are counted as whites when they are offending, but then become Hispanics and Arabs again when they are offended. When I think of discrimination, I think of allocation laws, affirmative action, where not the best man for the job is chosen, but instead people are chosen because of the color of their skin, as the saying goes, or that people are chosen because of their genitalia and not because of the merit. What do you think of when you hear prejudice or stereotypes? I bet you think of negative black stereotypes, or negative Muslim stereotypes, or negative homosexual stereotypes. Well, when I think of prejudice, I think of people saying that all whites are racist. I think of people saying that people that are white and are ethnically conscious are racist, inbred, fascist, Nazi, redneck, hillbilly, cousin lover, white trash, xenophobe, hater, ignorant, honky, cracker, peckerwood, bad at dancing, corny. When you think of a conspiracy nut, I bet you think of an anti-Semite. When I think of a conspiracy nut, I think of an anti-white, talking about white privilege, excluding that there exists such a thing as black privilege in Africa, or Asian privilege in Asia, or Jewish privilege in Israel, thinking that whites own the world and want to rule the world, ignoring that there is a Romanian privilege in Romania, an Italian privilege in Italy, a Ugandan privilege in Uganda, a Japanese privilege in Japan, and a Chinese privilege in China, always blaming it on the white man. What do you think of when you think of violent political groups? I bet you think of the far right, bald people walking around and doing the Roman salutes. Well, what I think of when I think of violent political groups is the far left, Black Brigade, slim teens in hoodies, Antifa, screaming whose streets, our streets, power, power to the people, down with the patriarchy, the very political movement that have problems with intra-rape issues, by male activists against female activists, the group who has committed the most violent crimes, the group with the black book on how to organize attacks and shut down peaceful demonstrations and speeches, who has a greater number of followers, that is to say a greater potential threat, as they are violently inclined and constitute a greater number of people. And the modern government, which does not recognize the right for freedom of association, that does not recognize the right for individuals to voluntarily, geographically congregate and live autonomously. Than it is for men, and for how much easier it is for females to win in court. I think of people that accuse men of committing more domestic violence, when in fact it is about half, and in some cases even more than half. And what I mean by that is that in half of the cases, females commit domestic violence against their males, or against their men. In some studies, it is actually reported that females commit more domestic violence than men, in some studies. Especially reciprocity violence. I think of individuals that defend Sharia law, or Muslims who in then turn disproportionately defend Sharia law, which discriminate against women and homosexuals. I think of people that demand that women ought to earn as much as men equal pay for an equal work, which is not true. Because if you control for same experience, same education, and same career path, women earn only about 2% less than men. So it's about the same. And it's basically down to career paths, education, choices. And this is all being controlled for. So I think when I think of sexism, that's what I think of. I think of people claiming that there's a patriarchy keeping out females. In some cases, women actually earn more than men. And I know that younger females earn more than younger males, about 3.7%, and still we hear about equal pay for equal work. And in the meanwhile, we are losing fertility levels, which means we are basically losing Westerners, and we have to be replaced. And in Europe, we're being replaced by people that are Muslims, who then disproportionately demand for Sharia law, ranging from about 30 to 40% of them, and the support increasing in the younger generations, Sharia law being homophobic and sexist against females. So that's what I think of when I think of sexism. What do you think of when you hear unfair privilege? I bet you think of rich white parents who provide good opportunities for their descendants or their kids or children. Well, what I think of when I think of unfair privilege is lazy, irresponsible individuals that demand that someone else is going to pay for their food, that tells that other people are obliged to pay for their children and to pay for their food and to pay for their health insurance, that basically are supposed to pay for the mess that their parents created, or basically against their will, against their consent, to demand by the state that they are forced to pay to demand by the state to steal from taxpayers and to provide money against their consent to those that are less responsible or less fortunate, who are a result of probably less responsible parents whose blame this really should be on. When I think of unfair privilege, I think of a people that defied the Ice Age, that defied harsh environments, that fought against invasions, that abolished slavery, that fought against emperors and oppressive kings. I think of a people that abolished religious dogmatism and had paid a price for it. I think of a people that, in majority, did not have a coercive interaction with non-whites. I think of a people that, on the contrary, lived quite separately. I think of a people that did not benefit from coercive interactions with the non-whites, as it was not beneficial. I think of a people that potentially fought a lot harder than other people, that potentially struggled a whole lot harder than other people, and I think of a people that potentially overcame the hardships that they had experienced for generations, and eventually were able to create a good infrastructure, a good solid society for their descendants, intended to be for their descendants. And I think of a people that, much like a family, shared recent ancestry, and whose descendants, whose shared descendants, shared thereby recent ancestry. And I think of this people as not unfairly privileged. I think of them as legitimately privileged, as their forefathers fought a lot harder, and struggled a lot harder. And then I think of unfair privilege, and I think of outside groups, much like parasites, saying that they want a piece of the cake too, that because their ancestors were irresponsible, and because these people's ancestors were not, they want a piece of the cake too. When I think of unfair privilege, I think of people that do not understand that we're not 6 billion ants on this earth. When I think of unfair privilege, I think of people that confuses sharing with a group of friends and relatives with sharing with strangers who you do not wish to associate with, and who you did not consent to associate with, and had you had the chance, would not consent to associate with. When I think of unfair privilege, I think of people that do not recognize that negative rights is more valid than positive rights. When I think of unfair privilege, I think of an individual that can pop out kids however they want, to live an irresponsible life, and then demand that others pay for their lives, or pay for their kids' lives. When I think of unfair privilege, I think of irresponsible individuals infringing on responsible individuals. I think of outside groups, one outside group infringing on another outside groups and demanding that they pay for them, and demand an outside group to pay to what is to them a strange, foreign, outside group food and health insurance, for to them a strange outside group they did not voluntarily associate with, against their consent. And if they do not go along with that, demand that the state steal from them. And if they oppose that, demand that the state put them in jail. And if they oppose that, demand that the government shoot them. To have the audacity to demand that from an outside group is unfair privilege. When I think of unfair privilege, I think of people saying that it is abuse when private citizens, private individuals, voluntarily share resources with their friends and relatives, direct, chosen associations, and calling that abuse. That is an unfair privilege. I think it's unfair privilege to say that forcefully sharing resources with strangers is not abuse. That is an unfair privilege. When I think of unfair privilege, I think of coercing responsible private citizens or individuals to pay for irresponsible strangers, and use the state's monopoly on force to go to the government for this, rather than to go to your friends and plead to your friends, or to go to people that voluntarily do charity. Do not do that and instead demand it. That is an unfair privilege. To have the state backing you up in that is an unfair privilege. That is what I think unfair privilege is. That is what I think of when I hear unfair privilege. What do you think of when you hear religious dogmatism? I bet what you think of when you hear religious dogmatism is Christianity. You think of the Pope. Well, what I think of when I hear religious dogmatism is Islam, Sharia law, and how it is okay to bash Christianity, how it is not only approved but even promoted and welcomed, but how bashing Islam, dismantling that from the West, is viewed as dangerous. So dismantling Islam is viewed as dangerous, and not dismantling Christianity is viewed as dangerous. What do you think of when you think of this label on outside restaurants or whatever? No, insert preferred ethnicity, welcome, question mark. I bet what you think of is back to science from the 1950s and the 1970s and 80s. Well, what I think of is modern science, 2005 to 2012, in Japan, saying no Ganji welcome, or no non-Japanese welcome, or Native American restrictions, or evictions, or Bairanis wanting Indians and Pakistanis and other Asians out. What do you think of when you think of Columbus? I bet you think of a racist white man wanting to steal America, killing all the natives. Well, what comes to my mind when I think of Columbus is a European sailor or explorer that ended up in South America when he intended to end up in India, and joined forces with the local Native American tribes that were oppressed by the greater Aztecs and Mayans, who had enslaved them for hundreds of generations. I think that many indigenous peoples never felt conquered, but rather that they had formed a partnership with a new power to both of their advantage. And this was, for an example, the case for most of the allied forces that helped Cortés defeat the Aztecs. We also know that most dead in war was not killed by sabers or bullets, but by clubs, who were used by the very large number of Native American tribesmen. We also know that Columbus and his men didn't constitute a whole lot of men. It wouldn't have been enough men to conquer the whole land. So what I think of when I think of Columbus, in short, is an explorer that joined forces with the native tribes there, formed alliances, and beat the Aztecs. When you think of lynchings, what do you think of? I bet you think that whites went out of their way to find any excuse to hang blacks. Well, when I think of lynchings, I think that whites were lynched at the rate 35.5% higher than their proportion in the population, whilst blacks were lynched at a rate lower than their proportion in the population. And if we look at the number of arrests today compared to how many were hanged back then per capita in proportion to the population, we see no difference. So as many people are being incarcerated today as were being hanged back then per capita in proportion to the population, and that these were ways in which they punished murderers or rapists, and that this actually had very little to do with race, looking at the numbers. What do you think of when you think of the colonialization, slavery, and imperialization? I bet you think of whites doing that exclusively to others. Well, what I think of when I think of colonialization, imperialization, and so on and so forth, is the Muslim slave trade in Eastern Europe. That's, by the way, where the word slave comes from. I think of the Moorish slave trade in Western and Southern Europe. I think of the Mongoloid attacks in Northeastern and Central Europe. I think of the Moorish colonialization of Southern Europe, particularly Spain. I think of the Ottoman Turks, or Muslims, in the East's colonialization of Eastern, Southern, and somewhat, I guess, Central Europe. I think of Arabs enslaving the Europeans for more than 1,000 years. I think of a 300-year Spain under Islamic rule. I think of Bosnia, Serbia, Greece, and Bulgaria under 500 years under the Ottoman Turkish rule. I think of Russia under 300 years of Tatar rule. What do you think of when you think of slavery? I bet you think of the whites coming down to Africa, viewing blacks as less than human and hunting them down and taking them to America, and everyone having their own slaves in America, everyone who was white. Well, what I think of slavery is that it's a long practice that existed all over the world by all humans, intra and interracially. I think that whites were enslaved by other peoples interracially before whites interracially enslaved others. I think Arabs treated their black slaves worse. That is why you don't have a lot of blacks in the Arabic countries these days compared to America. I think that whites were enslaved as well during the transatlantic slave trade. I think that slavery wasn't profitable at all. I think that whites abolished slavery not only in America by Abraham Lincoln, but also during the World War II. The Italian army abolished slavery in Ethiopia. I think blacks were slave owners as well. I think blacks have sold black slaves in Africa for hundreds and thousands of years. I think the Mali Empire captured slaves and sold them to whoever wanted to buy them. I think that blacks in New Orleans were 5 times more likely to own black slaves than the average white Southerner. I think that less than 1.4% of Americans had slaves, and I think that most white Americans that came after slavery even was abolished. When it comes to the South, I think that less than 5% of Southerners own slaves. When you think of colonialization, what do you think of? I bet you think of white men coming to claim resources and steal everything and oppress the minorities there. Well, when I think of colonialization, I think that the GDP increased. I think they introduced infrastructure. I think they introduced inventions that weren't there, such as the wheel. I think they increased lifespan, decreased infant mortality rates, decreased diseases, aside from America, who the natives were not resistant to a lot of diseases there. And I think the colonialized countries got introduced human capital. I think of South Africa that democratically gave up their own rule. Unlike the Bantus, Black Zulus, that committed the largest genocide in the human history of Khoisans and Xhosas and the rest of Africa, Bushmen. The Boers that came there actually lived peacefully with Xhosa and gave them reservations. I think of South Africa that gave the natives of South Africa their own land that they had before the Boers claimed South Africa. I also believe that they had the most fertile land, the most rainfall. I also believe there was less crime during apartheid than it was during the ANC. I also believe there was less AIDS. I also believe there was more jobs for blacks and whites. And I think that after colonialization, the wealth gaps between the races actually increased. And during colonialization, the wealth gaps decreased. I think a lot of the reasons for colonializing was not to oppress people, but to actually aid them. Much like this Coney 2012, it was to come there and liberate them from their lesser way of life, which is a supremacist way of looking at it, but I don't think there was a bad intention. What do you think of when you think of white trash? I bet you think of racist people. Racists who are living in rural areas, they're fucking their cousins, and they are low IQ people, they're drunk, they don't have any tooth, like to play on a banjo, they talk with a southern accent, even if they're from Britain or Denmark or Russia or Germany, they all talk with a southern accent, and one can easily dismiss anything they say because they're all ignorant. I bet that's what you think of. When I think of white trash, I think of dope heads. I think of poor communists in Russia, living in rural areas, still longing back to the good old days of Soviet Russia. having no teeth, living in poor houses, poorly constructed houses. I think of people that drink themselves unconscious and wake up in a pile of their own vomit in the morning. I think of hippies. I think of fat hippies dancing around to the sound of drums, wearing no underpants and a very brightly colored shirt with a big beard and long hair. I think of transsexuals. I think of emos that dress in too tight shirts and have too much wax in their hair and too much makeup around their eyes and their lips. I think of wiggers who walk around with a bandana and two baggy pants and a baggy shirt and too big of a trucker hat or whatever. I think of people that are white and believe they are Rastafaris, wear dreadlocks in combination with one of those dreadlock hats or whatever. I think of Lady Gaga, walks around wearing a toilet on her head. I think of weak, thin, sorry-looking whites screaming at street protests, wearing ugly haircuts and clothes deliberately ripped into shreds. I think of people that have piercings all over their faces and who have haircuts that look like some exotic rainforest animal have decided to move onto their head and use that as a permanent living space. When I think of trashy people, I think of people that rather go to the welfare office than to do their utmost to get a job. Many people that are so-called white trash rather take the full blame and be responsible citizens and not go to the welfare office. And somehow blacks are not called trash. Yet these responsible, quote-unquote, self-reliant individuals that show quite a lot of creativity in how they manage to live their lives despite being poor gets labeled trash for refusing to receive your money. And I also think it is interesting that they're called trash and how we can mock them and scoff at them, yet how we are supposed to treat blacks who are in the same situation as delicate little dolls, whose only reason for being in the situation they're in is because of the evil white man, and not because of bad choices, or shifting their responsibility to the white man instead of taking the responsibility themselves, like Asians, Jews have done, and poor whites are attempting to. Now this was just ramblings on my part, and I'm sure you might have a different view than I have, and I'm pretty sure I haven't touched on most things that I would have liked to touch on. This was just something I thought of, and I have nothing to do for half an hour, so I thought I would just as well consider and talk a little bit about what I think. Yeah, so this is basically how I view the world contra how most people view the world. So when we hear sexism, when we hear discrimination, where we have white trash, where we hear stereotypes, racism, when we hear all these things, I have different mental images in my head, and you guys have different mental images in your head. And who is more right? Well, I think I can make a case that I'm more right than you guys, and I think I can make a case that you're more conforming without actually questioning a lot of the mental assumptions that you have in your head. For example, I believe that racism is way more prevalent within the black community than within the white community. I think there's a lot more resentment. For an example, I also believe that blacks and other so-called minorities, soon-to-be majorities, have a stronger racial identity than the whites, although whites would argue, most whites would argue, most liberals in general, regardless of race, would argue that no, it is whites that are more racist and have a greater racial identity. Well, again, I think that's wrong, and I think I can make a case that it's wrong. I think I can provide stats that it's wrong. So that's basically how I view the world. It's not how most people view the world. Also, what's interesting is, for example, if I found a quote that was inconvenient, shall we say, for liberals and leftists, then they could say, oh, that person never existed historically, he has never existed. Oh, that quote doesn't represent all of us. Or that quote never happened. But they're not willing to be as, shall I say, inclusive in their deconstruction when it comes to quotes by, say, Nick Griffin of the BNP or Ron Paul. Racist newsletters, they tend to dismiss Ron Paul's explanation of how he's not racist, and people project their own assumptions onto him regardless if he has said, no, I never watched this. They don't want to trust his words, that's what I'm saying. However, we're supposed to trust their words, so oftentimes they will say, for an example, well, not all Muslims think that way. Well, not all liberals think that way. Not all liberals want the races to mix or whatever. And not all liberals want, for example, in the case of Jane Fonda's friend, his son married a black woman, and he shouted at he had said in the at the party there, whatever, that it was good because it's another step in that direction of the white genocide. And he was being serious when he said that. And Jane Fonda, I guess, was a little bit shocked, and everyone knows that Jane Fonda has some Marxist connections, I guess you could say. So people would then say that, well, that's not how all of us think, and in the meanwhile they defend forced association, they're against free association, and they would be against, for example, interracial marriages being illegal. I mean, I wouldn't. They would be against interracial relationships being illegal, made illegal, and I would agree with them that it should not be made illegal. But then they don't want to have like a geographic voluntary autonomy, i.e., secession. But they allow Native Americans to have that, and they think it's important to protect all other ethnic groups, be they Canadian or... So what I'm basically trying to say is that there's a lot of biases, and I view the world quite differently from others, I guess. That's basically all I want to say. Cheerio. Oh, and I'm aware how they view the world, but I guess they don't know why or how I view the world. There's a lot of false assumptions, like, for example, Hannibal Barca assumed that I wanted a Spartan-like society. There was another guy that assumed I wanted slavery. There's a lot of assumptions. Some people assume I hate other people. There's a lot of assumptions there, and what I'm trying to say is that even if I explain to them, no, that's not right, that's wrong, it wouldn't enter their mind. They would project that prejudice onto us. And then at the same time, they would say that it is us that are prejudiced, not them. And yeah, it's just interesting. Like, I'm aware how they think, but they don't seem to be aware how we actually think, or why we think it. And what I'm trying to say is that they're also quite bigoted, because when you grow up in school, for example, you're always taught their version of the world, the atheist cult's version on YouTube's worldview, and it's shut down in your throat. But when you come out into the real world, where you can actually research yourself, and when you have the incentive to, you realize that it's not as simple as the image or the picture that you were given, and you start to realize that there's more to these things than were being told to me when I was a child and when I was a teen and a young adult. So you start to look into things yourself, and you realize that, sure, not all revisionist sources are legit, but there's a lot more to these stories than the so-called official story, which actually in some cases is not official, because I was actually taught the Afrocentric view in school, but a lot of Egyptologists, I guess it's called, or yeah, whatever, they think that Egypt was a predominantly Caucasoid people, with occasional Nubians, slaves, and what else? Salespeople, and so on and so forth. So I was taught false histories also, this goes beyond Egypt. This also goes into World War II in some cases, and as I said, not all provisionism is correct, but surprisingly a whole lot is. And I was always taught, like, whenever you put on the television and you hear about sexism, you always hear about how men are discriminating women. When you look at domestic violence, when you Google it, you only see white women being beaten by men. And I mean, since I wasn't interested in the MRA movements, because I don't really, for some reason I was not interested in it. I didn't look into it, but then I looked into it and I saw that there was a lot of studies showing that women are actually beating men a whole lot more, and in some cases, men are barely beating women more, and it's actually very even. And but there can always be excuses like, yeah, well, men's violence is more, has more impact, it leads to more injury. And there's some studies showing that that is true. There's actually some studies that show that that is not true, and it's a mess. It's a jungle of information you have to go through, and I don't think any of those studies are going to accurately ever portray reality. But I didn't think that there was as much, like, the image I got from the media was that it was mostly men, like 99% of domestic violence is made by men. That's the image you get, but I never thought that it was like 40-60 or 50-50, or, you know, but it is. So, all I'm trying to say is that I know your worldview, and I obviously have another worldview than you guys. And you guys don't know our worldview, and I think that's because you are bigoted. You want to look at your own information. You want to look at critics of revisionism. You don't want to go to the actual revisionists themselves. And yeah, that's basically what I'm trying to say. Rather than to actually go to Lou Rockwell, you read the critics of Lou Rockwell, for example, or you read the critics of Ludwig von Mises, and you don't read Ludwig von Mises. French Elements explained this in his video, Argue a Bigot. And it's a good video. I think he really nails it in a way, because, you know, what worldview you're more likely going to hold on to in this zeitgeist? Well, it's the liberal worldview, where men commit domestic violence, where all whites are racist, and, you know, slavery, oh, it was whites against blacks. Very simplistic, very narrow-minded worldview, and whenever they want to look into this issue themselves, now that I told them a little bit of information from how I can view the world, well, then they want to look at the critics of the world view that I have. They want to look at it from their own perspective, right? So, not like I did when I was younger. I just thought, this sounds strange. I'm actually going to go to the original sources, or I'm actually going to go to the revisionist and hear what they actually have to say. I'm not going to biasly or bigotly go to people that confirm my own worldview and then hear their criticism of the so-called revisionists that have a different worldview. And it's interesting. It's interesting to do that. You'll learn a lot. And as a result, I've kind of alienated myself from most people, I guess, because now I view things so differently from most people that it's frustrating. I mean, if I put on the television, for an example, I put on the Swedish television this morning, and I saw a reportage by a guy that defended the ANC in South Africa. And if you know anything from ANC, from my perspective, it's a very bad thing. ANC is not a good thing. And I don't want to go into why, but like I said, if you want to go into the revisionist view of the critics of the ANC, do that. And you'll see their worldview. If you don't want to do that, and if you want to confirm your own worldview, then you go to the critics of ANC. And everything is fine and dandy in Rainbow Land again. Anyway, maybe. What I'm trying to say is that they defended ANC, and they showed concert from Sweden in the 80s, I believe it was, or 90s, excuse me. where somewhere around that era, where famous Swedish rock artists sang on a concert in Sweden, tried to attract attention and gain charity money that they could send to the ANC in South Africa. And now in 2012, they were sitting there on the sofa, post apartheid, and I'm certainly not defending apartheid, but what I'm trying to say is that the ANC has not been, it's not something you should defend either. Yet this guy was, and the television was biasly bashing apartheid and didn't mention anything of the good things that apartheid brought. What? There's good thing that apartheid brought? Yeah. Anyway, so when you turn on the television and you hear people talk and think, and you know, I saw a critic of a new show, and he said, "Oh, I don't want to see inbred white." What did he say now? I don't want to see inbred white trash comedy. And everyone had thumbed up his comment. Like, could you say inbred black nigger or black trash comedy? Would that be acceptable? Would that get a lot of thumbs up by like normal people? Because this was not a political site. This was actually promoted by the channel itself, because they didn't take the comment down. It was up for days and gotten a lot of thumbs up, and I'm tired of it. It's shitty. So yeah, that's how I view the world. How do you view the world?
What irritates me sometimes is critics will watch something and say, "Oh, look at cops, they misrepresent people of color." That's absolutely not true. It's au contraire. I show more white people than statistically what the truth is in terms of street crime. I mean, if you look at the prisons, it's 60-something% of people of color and 30-something% of white people, right? If you look at cops, it's 60% white, 40%. It's just the reverse. And I do that intentionally because I don't want to contribute to negative stereotypes.
What comes to your mind when you think of racism? I bet the Holocaust comes to your mind. The event in which lots of whites tortured and killed lots of Jews, blacks, etc. Well, what comes to my mind when I think of racism is a white man being beaten to death by a bunch of black thugs. What comes to your mind when you think of sexism? I bet it's women being oppressed. What comes to my mind are women laughing and joking on live television about a woman mutilating her husband. What comes to your mind when you think of discrimination against sexuality? Let me guess, homophobia. What comes to my mind are gay bars that allow gay people only, and the Christian couple who were arrested by a tyrannical minority of British police because they refused to let a gay couple sleep in their private hotel. If the state interferes with private ownership, that is tyranny. What comes to your mind when you think of a crime in which the victim had a massive age difference from the criminal. I bet you think of a young person being molested by an old person. Well, let me tell you what comes to my mind. What comes to my mind is an old person, an innocent, nice old person, being beaten up by a young scumbag. We cannot have these disgusting, hypocritical, left-wing double standards. The New World Order left-wing liberal elites would love us to believe that rape is always a man sexually assaulting a woman, even though there are many cases of women sexually assaulting men, and they would love us to believe that racism is whites discriminating against blacks. Well, a woman raping a man is just as bad as a man raping a woman, and blacks beating up whites is just as bad as whites beating up blacks, and yet these things are less heard of, they're less reported. These disgusting, hypocritical, left-wing, liberal, politically correct double standards are disgusting, and we must not put up with them. They are unacceptable.